In this section, we are going to talk about page layout grids. Page layout grids arranges the page content within the grid rows with grid columns floated inside those rows. So as you can see in this example, we are going to follow the tutorial on section 3.2, which starts on page 202. So rows and columns, they form a grid. The number of rows is based on the page content, and the number of columns is based on the numbers that provided the most flexibility in laying out the page content. So in here we have the grid column and we have the grid rows. The spaces between the rows are these, and the spaces between the columns are these. As you can see in here, the basic approach is to imagine that the page is composed of a system of intersecting rows and columns that form a grid. So this is how we can imagine this. The page designer then arranges the page elements within the grid. For example, one possible layout could compose of a main header element, then other three main sections, and as well as navigation bar and a footer and things like that. You can see on page 203 an example of the layout based on a grid. There are some advantages of using a grid. Grid adds order to the presentation of the page content. It's also a consistent, logical design that gives readers the confidence to find information they are looking for. Also, it's usable for people with disability and special need. It can increase the development speed with the systematic framework of the page layout as well. There are two basic types of grid layouts, fixed grids and fluid grids. In the fixed grid, the width of the column and margin are specified in the pixel, where every column has a fixed position. Fluid grid provide more supports across different devices or screens, which have different sizes. Columns width is expressed in terms of a percentage. Designing our own grid could be taking a long time. So to simplify this process, we can choose from the many CSS frameworks that are available on the web. Basically, a framework is a software package that provides a library of tools to design our website, including the style sheet for the grid page layout and built-in scripts to provide support for a variety of browsers and devices. Most frameworks include support for responsive design, so that you can easily scale your website for various devices such as mobile devices to desktop computers. There are some popular CSS frameworks that could include Bootstrap, YAML 4, 960 Grid System, Foundation 3, HTML Boilerplate, and Skeleton. Bootstrap is a very famous framework among a lot of designers. This framework does a lot of work in building the grid, but we still need to understand how they interact with the underlying code, including the style sheet that are using to have our grid, and as well as the other parts of the framework. So let's see how we can set up our grid. A grid layout is based on the rows of floating elements. Each floating element constitutes a column. The set of elements floating side by side can establish a row. Many grid layouts use the div or division element to mark distinct rows and columns of the grid. In this example, we can see a single row with two columns grid. So we are using the div class row and the div class with two columns, column 1 and column 2. The page content is placed within the div element. This is an example of proposed grid layout for the About Panacea chocolate page. This layout consists of three main rows. The first row contains the page title, and the third row contains the page footer. The second row consists of two columns. The first column displaying information about the company, and the second column displaying a list of frequently asked questions. Within the first row is a nested 2x2 grid containing short articles about chocolate. So there is a 2x2 nested grid within the first column of the second row. Same as what we have seen in the proposed grid layout, we can write the code for it. The code is as follows here. First row, which is showing as a div, the class row. Then we have the first column, and then we have the 2x2 grill nested within the first column of the second row. And also we have the second row in here, and then inside we have the second column, and then the last, as we have seen, we need to have a third row, and this is the structure of the third row. So you can actually follow on page 207 tutorial and follow this to see the output for it. Now that we have set up the grid for the page content, we can set up the style for the grid. So we can start with the grid rows first. Grid row contains floating columns. Since a grid row starts a new line within a page, it should only be displayed when both margins are clear of previously floated column. We can establish these rows for grid rows using these following styles. Clear both content, and we have a space there, and then we use the display as table as we have previously discussed in the page footer from the last sessions. Now we can create style row for the grid columns. Every grid columns needs to be also floated within its row. Grid columns are placed within a div element having the general class name. So we can use class equals colon call numerator denominator, where numerator denominator provides the fractional width of the column. So let's see the example. For instance, call 1-3 class indicates that the column is 1/3 the total row width. So the column is 1/3 of the total row width. So in here we can say 1/4 and 3/4 width column for this one. So each of them you can see that we can use this percentage sign here. Now that we have looked at the basic framework for our grid, we can add the page content to each of its rows and columns. To save us from typing the content, in the example that we have in the book, basically the owner has prepared a file containing the text of the article to appear in the About page. We can just insert that into there. So here we are adding this chocolate based paste that we copied. We are putting it here under for the text of the first row in the grid. Outlines are simply lines drawn around an element enclosing the element content, padding, and border spaces. So outline width, you can put value, specify the width of a line, and the properties of value could be thin, medium, or thick. The line color is set using the outline color property. Outline color specify the color of a line. Properties are color are CSL whose color name or the value. Outline style specifies the design of a line. Properties of a style can be solid, double, dotted, dashes, groove, inset, ridge, or outset. And useful design tool that WC is working toward adding the grid style to CSS. To create a grid display without the use of div elements, CSS is now adding the following grid-based properties. So the syntax that we are going to use for the grid is this one. Selector, open bracket, and this. Grid keyword for the display property established the selected elements will be displayed as the grid. The number of rows and columns in the grid are set by the grid template rows and grid template columns property, where track list is a space-separated list of row heights or column widths. Now, how can we assign content to grid cells? Once we have developed our CSS grid, we can place specific documents with a grid cell at the intersection of a specified row and columns. By default, all of the specified elements are placed in the grid cell located at the intersection of the first row and first column. To place an element in a different cell, we use grid row star, integer, and then grid row end integer, grid row column start integer, grid row column end integer. So integer defines the starting and ending row or column that contains this content. So in here, we have the section aside. So the grid row starts, we put for the integer value, we put 2. For the grid row end, we put 3. For grid column start, 1. And grid column end, 2. So in here, the aside element to cover the second and third row. So we have, it's going to cover second and third row, and the first and second column of the grid. Eventually, CSS-based grid will actually going to be replace the grid design via div elements. Once again, separating layout from the content. So right now, we should actually try to continue using our own create our own grid using these techniques that we talked about. But more and more is going to be replaced with this new technique. And also the browsers, such as Internet Explorer or other browsers, are actually starting to support the CSS grid styles. Okay, this is the end of tutorial 3 section 3.2. So this ends the tutorial for this week. We will have an assignment this week which will include section 3.1 and section 3.2 of this tutorial. I hope you have enjoyed this week's lecture. Take care. Bye-bye.